The order came through at 32 minutes past the 4th rotation cycle, and I knew before I read a single line that we had chosen the wrong enemy. I am Admiral Valith Saranis, former Supreme Fleet Commander of the Draelhari Dominion. I have shattered defense grids with a single command. I have stood on the bridge of my flagship and watched civilizations fold like paper in the wind, and I felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a job completed according to doctrine. I write this debrief from exile on a frozen outpost at the edge of charted space, where the Council sent me to rot in silence after I refused to help them bury the truth. They want this story erased from history. They want every species in the galaxy to forget what happened to the Draelhari Dominion in the 40 rotations that followed our greatest miscalculation. But I will not let them bury it. Because if another Draelhari commander ever makes the mistake I made, if another council ever votes for the war I fought, there will be no one left alive among our people to write anything at all. It began with greed. It always begins with greed. The Cathara Corridor was a band of resource-rich systems stretching across 40 light-years of contested space along the galaxy's mid-rim. Mineral deposits dense enough to fuel a civilization for millennia, rare element nebulae that produced compounds essential for advanced drive manufacturing, 3 habitable worlds with atmospheres so close to Draelhari standard that colonists could walk outside without breathing equipment. The corridor was a prize, and it had been unclaimed for centuries because no major power wanted to invest the military resources to hold it against potential rivals. The humans changed that. Quietly, without fanfare or territorial declarations, they had settled the corridor's eastern edge over the past several decades. Small colonies, agricultural outposts, mining stations, research facilities tucked into asteroid belts and orbiting gas giants. Nothing military, nothing threatening. Just people building lives in unclaimed space the way humans apparently did everywhere they went, spreading outward with a casual, almost careless momentum that our analysts described as undirected expansion. High Adjudicator Tyramus noticed them. Tyramus noticed everything that wasn't his, and he wanted the corridor. All of it, including the parts where human families had already built homes and planted crops and named the mountains after their grandparents. He presented his case to the Council with the polished confidence of a man who has never been told no. The corridor's resources would fuel the Dominion's next century of expansion. The human settlements were small, undefended, and legally ambiguous under galactic territorial law, and the humans themselves were, by every assessment our intelligence division had produced, the least threatening species in the region. I stood on the command deck of the Ashen Veil, my flagship, watching the tactical display paint the human colony world of Verada 4 in soft blue light. The planet turned slowly on the screen, its surface marked with the faint thermal signatures of human settlements glowing like scattered embers against the dark continental masses. Behind me, 400 warships held formation in the void between stars, their drives humming at idle, their weapons charged and locked. To my left, the communication array was already aligned with the diplomatic station, where a human ambassador waited to receive our ultimatum. To my right, my weapons officer had her fingers resting on the firing controls, her posture relaxed, her expression carrying the mild boredom of a professional who expected this to be routine. The ultimatum was a formality. Everyone in that room knew it. The fleet was positioned. The targeting solutions were calculated. The assault timeline was loaded into every ship's combat computer. Tyramus had made his decision before the Council vote, and the Council had voted yes, because Tyramus always got his yes. The ambassador would receive our demands, and then, regardless of her response, the attack would begin. We had conquered 11 species across 600 years. The Vorthan, who had fielded the largest fleet in the sector and held out for almost a full campaign season before their command structure collapsed. The Alessi, who had the most advanced planetary shields anyone had ever seen, shields we cracked in under a week. The Kelmarai, whose fanatical resistance had required us to deploy ground forces for the first and only time in modern Dominion history. One by one, they had knelt before Draelhari power, or been ground into dust beneath it. Our doctrine was simple, and it had never failed. Strike first. Strike with everything. Shatter their ability to fight before they even realize they are in a war. Then walk through the wreckage and plant your flag. The humans, according to every intelligence report stacked on my desk, were the easiest target the Dominion had ever identified. A fractured species, dozens of competing governments that spent more time arguing with each other than presenting a unified front to the galaxy. No centralized military command, colonial worlds that operated semi-independently, often openly disagreeing with their own homeworld over trade policy, territorial rights, and resource allocation. Our projections gave us a 14-to-1 force advantage in direct combat capability. The war, if you could even call it that, would last 60 standard rotations at most. Tyramus wanted it done in 30. I opened the channel to the diplomatic station. The human ambassador appeared on my screen, and I got my first look at the people we were about to destroy. Her name was Adela Vasic, middle-aged by human standards, with gray threading through dark hair and a face that carried the kind of stillness you only see in people who have already survived something terrible and emerged from the other side with their composure intact. She sat alone at a long table in a conference room that was too big for one person, and she looked directly into the camera lens as if she could see through it, through the relay stations and the encrypted channels and the vast distance of space, directly into my eyes. I delivered the ultimatum in formal Dralhari, the ceremonial language of conquest we used for all such occasions. Surrender the Cathara corridor in its entirety. Withdraw all human settlements within 90 standard rotations. Accept permanent exclusion from the region and all adjacent systems. Failure to comply would result in immediate and overwhelming military action. Vasic listened without moving. Her hands rested flat on the table. Her breathing was even. When I finished, she did not stand. She did not raise her voice. She did not make threats or plead for time, or invoke treaties or galactic law. She picked up the document I had transmitted, a formal declaration of intent bearing the seals of the full Dralhari Council, and she read it slowly from beginning to end. Then she set it down on the table, with the care of someone handling something fragile. She asked one question. Is this the decision of your full council, Admiral, or just your military command? The distinction mattered to her. I could see it in the way she asked, the careful weight she placed on the word full, the slight pause before she spoke, as if she was giving herself one final moment to hope for a different answer. She wanted to know if there was anyone in the Dominion who disagreed, anyone who might pull us back from the edge. She was offering us a door, one last exit from the corridor we were marching down, and she was doing it so quietly that most of my officers didn't even realize what was happening. I relayed her question to Tyramus through the command channel. His response was immediate and carried the tone of a man irritated by a delay he considered unnecessary. Full council authorization, unanimous vote. No dissent. I told Vasic. She nodded once, a small, controlled motion that carried the finality of a door closing. Then we have nothing further to discuss, she said, and the screen went dark. My tactical officer glanced at me and shrugged. They always fold, he said casually, adjusting a sensor display. Remember the Kelmarai? 3 rotations of posturing and chest beating, and then unconditional surrender. These humans don't even have a proper fleet. We'll be back at Dralhar Prime in time for the victory celebrations. I should have noticed the difference. I should have seen what was right in front of me. The Kelmarai ambassador had wept openly when we delivered our ultimatum. The Alessi representative had screamed threats, thrown objects, and slammed his fists on the table hard enough to crack the surface. The Vorthan delegation had begged, literally begged, on their knees, for more time. Every species we had cornered reacted with emotion, with desperation, with the raw, uncontrolled panic of a creature that sees the predator closing in and knows it cannot escape. Vasic had shown none of that. She had been calm the way deep water is calm, still on the surface and hiding everything that moves beneath. I was too arrogant to wonder what was down there. The first strike launched at the top of the next rotation cycle. 3 targets, simultaneous assault, coordinated across light years with the precision the Dralhari fleet was famous for. Before received the Ashen Veil and its full escort group, 200 warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel, so close to the planet that its orbital defense stations barely had time to register our presence before we were already firing. We hit their military installations first, what few they had, small defense platforms. A handful of armed patrol ships that tried to form a line between us and the planet. Then their communication relays. Then their power grid. The colony went dark in 40 minutes. Smoke rose from the surface, where our orbital strikes had hit ammunition stores and fuel depots. The defensive patrol ships drifted in pieces through the orbital debris field. Calliston Ring, a mining station belt in a neighboring system, fell even faster. The human workers there had no warships at all, just a handful of armed transports that scattered the moment our attack group appeared on their sensors. We didn't bother chasing them. Destroying the mining infrastructure was sufficient. Themis Station, a deep space research facility near the corridor's midpoint, put up the hardest fight. The humans there had repurposed 2 civilian cruisers with improvised weapons systems, bolting military-grade beam emitters onto cargo frames in a configuration that no Draelhari engineer would ever have considered functional. But it was functional enough. They actually managed to score direct hits on 3 of our destroyers, burning through armor plating and disabling a secondary weapons array before we overwhelmed them with concentrated fire. I respected that. They fought knowing they had no chance, and they fought well. It changed nothing, but I noted it in my log. All 3 targets neutralized within 6 hours. Draelhari casualties across the entire operation were negligible. 17 wounded. No ships lost. The projections had been conservative, if anything. This wasn't a war. It was a procedure, executed with the mechanical efficiency that had made the Dominion the most feared military power in the galaxy. I filed my initial combat report with the Council and permitted myself a moment of professional satisfaction. Clean strikes, precise execution, minimal collateral beyond the designated target zones. The Cathara corridor was ours. Then the transmission arrived. It came on an open frequency, unencrypted, broadcast wide enough that every ship in the fleet received it simultaneously. No video feed, no identification header, no point of origin that our communication officers could trace. Just a voice, male, steady, speaking in accented Draelhari. That alone made me pause. In 6 centuries of conquest, in all the wars we had fought, and all the species we had broken, no alien had ever bothered to learn our language. They didn't need to. The conquered speak the tongue of the conqueror. That is how it works. That is how it has always worked. But this human spoke Draelhari with a careful precision that told me he had studied it deliberately, had taken time he didn't need to take to learn our words and our grammar, and the particular rhythm of our formal military register. He wasn't struggling with our language. He was using it like a weapon, forcing us to hear his words in our own tongue so there could be no misunderstanding, no ambiguity, no comfortable distance of translation. He said 9 words. You want war? Then watch as your worlds burn. The transmission ended. Silence filled the command deck, like cold water filling a hold. My tactical officer shifted in his seat. My weapons officer glanced at me with raised brow ridges. I waited for the tension to break, and after a long, stretching moment, my intelligence chief let out a short, dismissive laugh. Others followed. Within seconds, the deck was full of quiet chuckling and shaking heads. Bravado. Empty posturing from a beaten enemy. The desperate bluster of a species that had already lost and didn't know it yet. I allowed myself to join them. One brief smile. One shared moment of certainty that we were the strongest force this galaxy had ever produced. And nothing, certainly not a species that couldn't even defend 3 border colonies, could challenge that truth. I record this moment in detail because I want the record to show exactly how wrong we were. I want every officer who reads this debrief, every council member who reviews it, every cadet who studies it in whatever training academy still stands when this document finally surfaces, to understand that the laughter of fools sounds exactly like confidence until the fire reaches your door. That was the last time any of us laughed. I expected the counterattack on the 2nd day. My tactical doctrine, the doctrine I had been trained in and had executed flawlessly across 8 campaigns spanning 40 years of service, assumed a predictable enemy response pattern. You strike first, the enemy reels. They scramble to organize a response, pulling scattered units together, activating reserves, establishing communication with whatever command authority survived the initial blow. They throw whatever they have at your forward positions in a desperate attempt to regain momentum. You absorb the blow, crush the counterattack with your superior concentrated force, and advance into the vacuum left behind. Simple, reliable, proven across 11 conquered civilizations. Every species we had fought followed this pattern. Every single one. The timeline varied. Some counterattacked within hours. Some took days to gather their forces. But the response was always the same. A conventional military action directed at our forward positions, driven by the instinct to push back against the invader. On the second day after our first strike, nothing happened. On the third day, nothing happened. On the fourth day, nothing happened. By the fifth day, I was standing at my tactical display watching empty space stretch in every direction and feeling something I had not experienced since my first combat deployment 4 decades ago. Not fear, exactly. 3 Ilhari officers are trained to manage fear. It was something subtler and more dangerous. Unease, the gnawing awareness that the silence wasn't empty. It was full of something I couldn't see. Human colonial worlds were going dark across the entire eastern sector. Not destroyed, not attacked, just silent. One by one, their communication networks shut down. Not crashed, not jammed, but shut down, deliberately and systematically, as if someone had walked through every relay station and every broadcast tower and flipped the switches off in a carefully planned sequence. Trade lanes that had carried thousands of civilian vessels per rotation emptied overnight. Shipping beacons went offline. Navigation buoys stopped transmitting. It was as if someone had drawn a curtain across an entire arm of the galaxy. My intelligence analysts gathered in the briefing room and presented their assessment with the confident authority of people who had been right about everything their entire careers. What we were seeing, they explained, was collapse, panic-driven fragmentation. The fractured human political structure, already weak, had shattered completely under the pressure of our first strike. Colonial governors were acting independently, cutting communication with each other and with their homeworld, pulling inward to protect their own populations. The communications blackout wasn't a strategy. It was chaos. The humans were falling apart exactly the way our pre-war models predicted they would. Their reports used words like disorganized retreat and infrastructure abandonment and systemic command failure. They projected that human military capability, such as it was, had degraded by at least 60% in the first week. The consensus recommendation was to advance immediately, push deeper into the corridor, and begin occupying the evacuated colony worlds before the humans could reorganize. I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them, because the alternative, that the silence was intentional, that an entire civilization had gone dark on purpose, was something I did not want to consider. I ordered the fleet to advance. The first convoy disappeared on the 6th day. 46 ships, supply vessels carrying fuel cells, munitions, and replacement components for the forward fleet's weapon systems. They departed from our staging area at the Draelhari outpost world of Kelsor Primus, followed a standard transit route through cleared and supposedly secured space, and were expected to arrive at our forward position in 9 hours. At the 4-hour mark, they sent their scheduled check-in signal. Course nominal, speed nominal, no contacts on sensors, everything proceeding exactly according to the flight plan. At the 5-hour mark, they missed their check-in. At the 6-hour mark, I sent a scout squadron to investigate. The scouts arrived at the convoy's projected position and found nothing. Not wreckage, not debris, not an energy signature, a fuel trace, a distress beacon, or a single fragment of hull plating drifting in the void. 46 ships carrying enough supplies to sustain a campaign fleet for 20 rotations had simply ceased to exist. The space where they should have been was empty and cold and indifferent, as if nothing had ever passed through it. I stood at the tactical display and stared at the gap in my logistics chain and told myself it was an anomaly, a navigation error, an uncharted gravitational distortion that had pulled the convoy off course into an unmapped region. I ordered expanded sensor sweeps across the entire transit corridor and filed a preliminary report with the Council noting the loss. Then it happened again. 3 days later, a second convoy vanished. 28 ships this time, carrying reactor components and medical supplies. Same pattern. Routine departure. Nominal check-in, missed check-in, and then silence so complete, it felt like the universe had opened a mouth and swallowed them whole. My scouts swept the route for 2 full rotations. They found nothing, not a molecule of evidence that the convoy had ever existed. By the 16th day of the war, we had lost 7 convoys. 70% of our resupply capacity for the forward fleet was gone. 2 full patrol squadrons, 12 warships each, had vanished during routine sector sweeps. And a listening post on the fringe of Draelhari core space, 1,000 light-years from the front lines, deep inside territory we had controlled without challenge for centuries, was gone. That last one shattered something in my understanding of what we were facing. The convoys had disappeared in contested territory, in the space between our lines and theirs, where an ambush was at least theoretically conceivable. But the listening post was ours, deep inside our borders, staffed by 40 intelligence operatives in a hardened station, equipped with its own defense grid, its own weapon systems, and enough sensor coverage to detect a ship approaching from 3 systems away. Gone. All 40 crew members. The station itself was still there when my investigators arrived, still intact, still drawing power from its reactor, its lights still burning in the dark. But every person inside had vanished. Every databank had been wiped clean, every file erased, every piece of recorded intelligence deleted, with a thoroughness that our own security protocols couldn't match. The only thing my team found was a single line of text, scratched into the surface of the station commander's desk, in neat, precise Draelhari script. It read, "We were here." I pulled up a star chart that evening and plotted every disappearance, every lost convoy, every vanished patrol, the gutted listening post. I marked each one with a red indicator and stepped back and looked at the pattern that emerged across the 3-dimensional display. It was not random. It was not the scattered, opportunistic harassment of a desperate enemy lashing out wherever they could reach. It was architecture. Every lost convoy had been carrying a specific category of supply that would take the longest to replace. Every vanished patrol had been covering a specific sensor gap that, once opened, created a blind corridor in our detection network large enough to fly a battle group through undetected, and the listening post had been the primary relay node for our intelligence network across the entire eastern operational sector. Without it, our ability to monitor enemy movements in that region was reduced to guesswork. Someone was disassembling our operational capability with the calm precision of an engineer removing load-bearing components from a structure. Not randomly, not frantically, methodically. Each piece removed in sequence, each gap created to enable the next operation, each loss compounding the one before it, until the entire framework of our campaign was riddled with structural weaknesses we hadn't known existed until it was too late to repair them. The humans were not retreating. They were not collapsing. They were not fragmenting under pressure. They had gone dark because they were repositioning, and by the time I understood what that meant, they were already behind my lines, inside my borders, moving through the gaps in my sensor coverage with the quiet confidence of predators who know the terrain better than the creatures that live on it. I called my senior staff to the briefing room and told them what I believed. Half of them looked at me as if I had taken leave of my senses. The Draelhari Dominion had not been infiltrated in 400 years. Our borders were secured by overlapping sensor arrays that could detect a ship at faster-than-light speed from multiple systems away. The idea that human strike forces were operating deep inside our territory without triggering a single alert was, to them, simply not possible within the laws of physics as they understood them. Then my chief engineer arrived with something that silenced every voice in the room. A scouting team had recovered wreckage from a destroyed human reconnaissance drone near one of the vanished convoy routes. The drone itself was unremarkable, a standard surveillance unit no bigger than a crew shuttle, its systems badly damaged by whatever had destroyed it. But its hull was coated in a material that my engineer had never encountered in 40 years of working with advanced military technology. It wasn't stealth coating. We had stealth coating. Every major power in the galaxy had some version of sensor-absorbing material that reduced a ship's detection signature. This was something entirely different. This material didn't just absorb sensor waves. It actively sampled the radiation environment around it and generated a matching emission pattern that was indistinguishable from the natural background. In open space, It mimicked the cosmic microwave background. Near a star, it mimicked solar radiation. Inside an asteroid field, it mimicked mineral signatures. A ship coated in this material could fly through the heart of our most sophisticated sensor grid and register as nothing more than a patch of ordinary space. Not stealthy, not reduced signature, invisible. Perfectly, completely, physically invisible to every detection system the Draelhari Dominion had ever built. My engineer told me, with visible fear pulling at the muscles of his face, that the coding technology was at least 3 generations ahead of anything the Dominion had developed or even theorized. I asked him how that was possible for a species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel 4 centuries ago, a species we had rated as technologically inferior, a species whose shipyards we had destroyed in the first hours of the war. He stared at the fragment of drone hull on the briefing table and shook his head slowly. He had no answer. None of us did. The first direct military engagement came at Kelsor Primus, the same outpost world that had served as our primary staging area. I had reinforced its orbital defense grid after the convoy losses, adding additional sensor platforms, redundant power relays, and a garrison fleet of 60 warships stationed in a layered defensive perimeter. The grid was the most advanced system the Dominion had ever deployed, capable of detecting and interdicting any ship attempting to drop out of faster-than-light travel within weapons range of the planet. Our engineers had certified it as impenetrable. The human strike force dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside the grid. Not near it, not at its outer boundary. Inside it. In the gap between the innermost defense platforms and the upper atmosphere of the planet itself, a zone of space so tightly monitored and controlled that our own ships required individually coded clearance transmissions to enter. They appeared on our sensors for exactly 11 seconds, and in those 11 seconds, they accomplished more than most fleets achieve in an entire campaign. 6 shots, 6 precisely targeted beam strikes, aimed at 6 specific power relays, connecting the grid's orbital platforms to their primary power generation facility on the planet's surface. The relays were buried deep inside armored housings, positioned at coordinates that were classified at the highest level of Dominion military security. The humans hit all 6. The relays exploded, the grid lost power. Every orbital platform, every sensor array, every weapons emplacement in the defensive network went dark simultaneously, as if someone had reached into the system and pulled out its spine. By the time our garrison fleet powered weapons and oriented toward the intruders, the human ships were gone. They had vanished back into faster-than-light travel with the same impossible precision that had delivered them, disappearing from our sensor displays between one scan cycle and the next. Our warships fired their weapons at empty space. Our sensors showed nothing but background radiation. Kelsor Primus, one of the oldest and most strategically important outpost worlds in the Dominion's colonial network, sat exposed and naked under a dark sky. But the humans did not follow up. They did not invade the planet. They did not strike at the surface installations or the civilian population centers. They did not press their advantage or attempt to hold the system. They stripped away every layer of defense we had built around that world, and then they left, withdrawing in absolute silence, leaving behind nothing but the drifting wreckage of 6 power relays and a garrison fleet that had not fired a single effective shot. It was a message, delivered with surgical precision and absolute economy of force, and I received it with perfect clarity. They could have taken the planet. They could have bombarded the surface. They could have destroyed the garrison fleet, while it sat confused and disoriented in the aftermath of the grid collapse. Instead, they demonstrated that they could penetrate our most sophisticated defenses at will, strike any target they chose, and withdraw before we could respond. And they left Kelsor Primus standing as proof that they chose not to destroy it. Not because they lacked the capability, because they wanted us to understand just how far that capability extended. I stood alone in my quarters that night and read through every intelligence file our division had ever compiled on humanity, the cultural profiles, the political analyses, the military capacity assessments, the technology surveys. All of them described a fractured, disorganized, technologically mediocre species, incapable of sustained coordinated action on a galactic scale. All of them were wrong. Not slightly wrong, not partially inaccurate, wrong in the fundamental, catastrophic, soul-destroying way that only comes from looking directly at the truth and seeing what you expect to see instead of what is actually there. The fractures were camouflage. The competing governments, the independent colonies, the public disagreements and political bickering that our analysts had photographed and cataloged and cited as evidence of systemic weakness were a mask, a performance, a surface-level display of chaos that hid something else entirely, something coordinated and patient and enormously powerful that had been watching us for far longer than we realized. Whatever was behind that mask was now looking directly at the Draelhari Dominion with the cold, focused attention of an intelligence that understood exactly what we were and exactly how to take us apart. I drafted a message to Tyramus that night. I abandoned diplomatic language. I told him our intelligence assessments were compromised at every level. Our supply infrastructure was collapsing. Our sensor network was degrading faster than we could repair it. And the enemy we were fighting bore no resemblance to the enemy we had prepared for. I recommended an immediate operational pause, a withdrawal to consolidated defensive positions, and the opening of diplomatic channels before the situation deteriorated beyond recovery. Tyramus replied in 4 words. "Continue the advance, Admiral." They recalled me to Draelhar Prime 17 days after the first strike, not because they had finally accepted my assessment, because the situation had deteriorated so severely that even Tyramus, insulated behind his walls of certainty and surrounded by advisors who told him only what he wanted to hear, could no longer maintain the fiction that the campaign was proceeding according to plan. I walked into the council chamber on the Dominion homeworld and felt something I had never felt in that room before: fear. Not the sharp, functional fear of combat, which I understood and could channel into action. This was different. Slow, heavy, a dread that seeped in through the walls and settled into the bones. The kind of fear that comes when you realize the ground beneath your feet is not solid, and you don't know how deep the hollow goes. The numbers told the story. 23 supply convoys lost since the war began. 11 outpost worlds stripped of their defense grids with the same surgical precision I had witnessed at Kelsor Primus. 4 deep space listening posts gutted, their crews vanished, their databanks erased. 2 full patrol fleets, 24 warships, gone without wreckage or distress signals. Forward deployed units were operating on rationed fuel and dwindling munitions reserves. Morale across the fleet had dropped from confident to uncertain to something my officers described, when they were being honest, as quietly afraid. And in all of that systematic destruction, in all those weeks of being methodically dismantled across 1,000 light-years of operational space, we had not once engaged a human capital ship. Not once. Every vanished convoy, every neutralized defense grid, every gutted listening post had been accomplished by small, fast strike units that materialized from empty space and dissolved back into it before our weapons could acquire a targeting solution. We were being defeated by an enemy we couldn't find, couldn't track, couldn't see, and couldn't fight. The council chamber held 32 seats arranged in a semicircle around a central tactical display. When I entered, every seat was occupied. That alone told me how critical the situation had become. The full council had not convened in this chamber since the Kelmarai Rebellion, 40 years earlier, and the Kelmarai Rebellion, a border insurrection that we had crushed in 6 rotations, was a minor disturbance compared to what we now faced. Tyramus sat at the head of the table in his ceremonial armor, its polished surface catching the light of the overhead displays. He looked exactly as he always did, composed, imperial, radiating the absolute certainty that had carried him to the highest seat of power in the Dominion. But I had served under him for 20 years, and I could read the signs his public mask couldn't quite conceal: the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the armrests of his chair with a pressure that whitened his knuckles, the slight, almost imperceptible delay before he spoke, as if he was choosing his words with a care that had never been necessary before. He asked me one question, and he asked it loudly enough for every governor, every military commander, every political functionary in that room to hear. How is a species with a fraction of our fleet tonnage winning this war? I had prepared for this question. I activated the central tactical display and began laying out the analysis my team had assembled over the past 2 weeks, drawing from intercepted communications, recovered technology samples, pattern analysis of every engagement, and the handful of intelligence reports that had survived the communications blackout. The core problem, I explained, was doctrinal. The Dominion fights the way we have always fought, and the way we have always fought is built on a single principle: mass concentration. We identify the enemy's center of gravity, their command structure, their capital, their primary fleet concentration. We gather our forces. We strike that center with overwhelming power, and when it breaks, the enemy breaks with it. It is a doctrine that rewards strength, punishes weakness, and produces decisive results against any enemy that organizes itself the way we do, with hierarchical command, centralized authority, and concentrated military assets. The humans do not organize this way. What they had deployed against us was not a fleet in any sense we understood the word. It was a network, a web of thousands of small, autonomous units, each one operating semi-independently within a larger strategic framework that no single unit needed to fully comprehend. They didn't concentrate force. They distributed it. Instead of massing for one decisive blow, they delivered 1,000 small strikes across 1,000 different points simultaneously. Each individual action was too minor to justify diverting a fleet response. But collectively, compounding day after day and week after week, those small actions were bleeding the Dominion's operational capability dry. I showed the Council the logistics. Our supply reserves were down 34% and declining. Our sensor coverage had gaps large enough to fly a full battle group through without detection. Our forward positions were consuming fuel and munitions faster than we could replenish them, because every replacement convoy we dispatched had a 1 in 3 probability of never arriving at its destination. We were not losing battles because there were no battles to lose. We were losing a war of attrition against an enemy that refused to give us the kind of fight our doctrine was designed to win. Governor Aldris, who controlled the Dominion's primary industrial sector and understood supply chains better than any military officer, asked the question the room was collectively avoiding. Where are they building these strike units? We destroyed their shipyards. I told him we had destroyed the shipyards we knew about. Humans, it appeared, had built others. Then I presented the intelligence report that changed the atmosphere of the entire session. One of our deep cover operatives, an agent who had infiltrated a human colony world before the communications blackout began, had managed to transmit a final report through a chain of dead-drop relay satellites positioned months earlier for exactly this contingency. She knew the transmission would reveal her position to human counterintelligence. She sent it anyway, because what she had witnessed was more important than her personal survival. The colony she was stationed on was a settlement called Gareth's Landing. Before the war, it had been a mid-sized agricultural world. 60,000 civilians, farms stretching across river valleys, schools and medical clinics and community centers. The kind of quiet, productive, unremarkable place that our analysts had pointed to as evidence of human ordinariness. When the war began, Gareth's Landing did not panic. It did not fragment. It did not descend into the chaos and disorder our models predicted. In the space of 4 standard days, the entire colony restructured itself for war production with a speed and totality that our operative described as unlike anything she had encountered in decades of intelligence work. Every factory switched from civilian manufacturing to military component production. Agricultural processing facilities began fabricating drone chassis from recycled farm equipment and construction materials. The colony's medical center repurposed its pharmaceutical synthesis laboratory to produce compounds designed to counter Draelhari atmospheric warfare agents. The school gymnasium was cleared, refitted with assembly equipment, and converted into a production line for targeting and navigation systems. None of it was ordered. There was no military governor issuing directives, no conscription notice posted in the town square, no armed soldiers going door to door compelling compliance. The colony's elected mayor, a woman our operative described as soft-spoken and unremarkable, called a community meeting in the central agricultural hall. She explained the situation. She described what had happened to Verada 4, and Calliston Ring, and Themis Station. She asked for volunteers. Every adult in the settlement raised their hand. Every single one. Our operative described watching a woman named Grace Whitfield, a schoolteacher who spent her days educating children in mathematics and literature, spend every night after classes ended assembling precision targeting components on a makeshift workbench in the gymnasium. Her hands were steady. Her focus was absolute. She worked with the quiet efficiency of someone performing a task they considered both necessary and obvious, the way you would board up windows when you see a storm approaching. Not heroic, not dramatic, simply what needed to be done. She described a retired doctor named Henry Calloway, who converted his home kitchen into a chemical laboratory and spent his days formulating biological countermeasures against compounds found in Dralhari atmospheric ordnance. He had no military training. He had no access to classified information about our weapons systems. He reverse-engineered the countermeasures from publicly available scientific papers and his own medical expertise, working alone at a kitchen table surrounded by improvised equipment. She described teenagers organizing scrap collection drives across the settlement, racing through neighborhoods in borrowed vehicles, systematically stripping every non-essential structure of metal, polymers, and electronic components that could be fed into the manufacturing pipeline. They kept inventories. They ran logistics calculations. They prioritized materials by production urgency without being told how. The operative's final assessment was the last thing she transmitted before going silent. I read it aloud to the council, and the room fell so quiet I could hear the air recyclers humming in the walls. They are not an army. They are a civilization that has decided, collectively and without hesitation, to become one. I have infiltrated military organizations on 9 worlds across 3 decades of service. This is not that. This is something I have no analytical framework to describe. Every individual is acting autonomously, making independent decisions about how best to contribute, and yet they are all moving in the same direction, toward the same objective, with a coordination that requires no orders because the intent is already shared. It is as if the entire species received the same signal at the same moment and responded with the same answer. I do not believe the Dominion has ever faced anything like this. I do not believe anyone has. The council chamber was silent when I finished. Tyrimus stared at the display for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to me and asked what I recommended. I told him the truth. I recommended an immediate strategic withdrawal to defensible positions along our core territorial border. Consolidate our forces, seal the gaps in our sensor network, re-establish our supply infrastructure within secure space, and then, from a position of consolidated strength, rather than extended vulnerability, open a diplomatic channel with humanity, and negotiate an end to the conflict. The Cathara corridor was not worth what this war was costing us, and every rotation we continued to fight was a rotation the humans used to tighten whatever net they were building around us. Tyrimus listened with the patience of a man who has already decided. He nodded slowly, acknowledging my assessment with the courtesy protocol required. Then he overruled me. The council voted, 15-2 in favor of Operation Ashfall. I voted against. Governor Aldris voted against. Everyone else, driven by pride and fear, and the desperate need to believe that the Dominion's military supremacy could still be salvaged through one bold stroke, voted yes. Operation Ashfall was simple in concept and staggering in scale. Forget the corridor, forget the outposts, forget the supply lines and the listening posts, and the slow hemorrhage of resources across 1,000 small engagements. Assemble the largest fleet the Dominion had ever gathered, every available warship from every sector, and drive it straight at Earth, the human homeworld, the origin point of their species, the center of their civilization. Destroy it, and you destroy their spirit. Shatter their will. Break the connection that binds their scattered colonies together. The colony worlds would surrender one by one, leaderless and demoralized, and the Dominion would have its victory. I wanted to stand at that table and shout. I wanted to tell them that every piece of evidence we had gathered demonstrated with overwhelming clarity that humanity had no single center of gravity, that their strength was distributed across hundreds of worlds and billions of individuals, that the woman assembling targeting components in a gymnasium on Gareth's Landing would not stop working because a planet she had never visited was burning, that destroying Earth would not break them any more than cutting one branch from a forest kills the trees. But I had served the Dominion my entire life. When the council spoke, the fleet obeyed. That was the oath I had taken. That was the foundation my career was built on. and so I swallowed my objections and turned to the work of assembling the instrument of our own destruction. The Armada took 4 rotations to gather, 4,200 warships, drawn from every sector command in the Dominion, battle cruisers and dreadnoughts, carrier groups loaded with fighter wings and heavy bomber squadrons, destroyer screens and torpedo flotillas, support vessels carrying fuel and munitions for a sustained campaign, troop transports loaded with ground forces for the occupation that Tyramus was certain would follow our victory. It was the largest concentration of military force the Draelhari had fielded in 300 years, and when I looked at it on my tactical display, the formation spread across so much space that it resembled a small galaxy, thousands of lights burning against the dark. We departed for Seoul on the 19th day of the war. The journey took 12 rotations, at maximum faster-than-light speed, 12 rotations of transit through open space. Our fleet stretched across light years in a formation that must have been visible on every sensor grid, from one side of the sector to the other. We were not hiding. We were not being subtle. 4,000 warships moving at full speed toward the enemy homeworld is not a maneuver that lends itself to stealth. Tyremus wanted the humans to see us coming. He wanted them to feel the weight of what was approaching. He believed that the sight of the largest fleet ever assembled, bearing down on their planet, would crack their resolve before we even fired a shot. During those 12 rotations, I expected resistance, ambushes at transit choke points, minefields along the approach vectors, hit-and-run strikes against our flanks and rear guard. The humans had demonstrated repeatedly that they could reach us anywhere, appear from nothing, strike with precision, and vanish. A fleet this size, stretched thin across transit space, was the most obvious and inviting target in the galaxy. Nothing happened. The corridor between Dominion space and Seoul was clear. No patrols, no mines, no ambushes. Our sensors swept the space ahead of us and behind us, and on every side, and found nothing but empty starlight and the cold radiation of distant galaxies. The approach to Earth was wide open, as if someone had cleared the path, swept it clean, and left a light burning at the end to guide us in. My officers interpreted this as vindication. The humans had committed so many resources to their distributed harassment campaign that they had nothing left to defend their homeworld. The mood aboard the Ashen Veil shifted from grim determination to something approaching its old confidence. 4,000 warships against an undefended planet, the shortest engagement in Dominion history. I stood at my tactical display and watched Saul grow closer on the long-range sensors and felt nothing but cold. The humans had not made a single strategic error in the entire war. Every move they had made, from the communications blackout to the invisible convoys to the precision strikes that stripped our outpost worlds bare, had been calculated with a brilliance that made our own strategists look like children playing war games. The idea that they had simply forgotten to defend their homeworld was not reassuring. It was the most frightening thing I had experienced in 40 years of service. We dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system on the 31st day of the war. Earth appeared on our long-range sensors, a small blue sphere orbiting an ordinary yellow star, wrapped in wisps of white cloud and glowing with the reflected light of its moon. It looked peaceful, fragile, beautiful, in a way I had not expected and did not want to acknowledge. Exactly the kind of world the Dominion had been built to consume. Then my sensor officer reported the anomaly, and her voice cracked on the second word. Between the 4th planet and the system's primary asteroid belt, there was a field of objects, thousands of them, arranged in a geometric lattice pattern too precise to be natural, too large to be defensive satellites, too energetic to be anything benign. Each object was roughly the size of a Draelhari destroyer, but their energy signatures bore no resemblance to anything in our database. They were not ships, they were not stations. They were drawing power directly from the star, channeling solar energy through focusing arrays that my engineer identified, after 17 minutes of increasingly frantic analysis, as stellar accelerators. I asked him what a stellar accelerator was designed to do. He looked at me with an expression I will carry in my memory until I die. It was the face of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and wished with every fiber of his being that he did not. He explained, in a voice that had gone flat and mechanical with shock, that the theory behind stellar acceleration had existed in Dralhari physics for centuries, but no civilization had ever been reckless enough, or desperate enough, or determined enough to actually build one. The concept was straightforward. You channel enough precisely focused energy into a star's corona to trigger a cascading thermonuclear reaction in its outer layers. The star does not explode, it flares. A controlled, directed eruption of radiation and superheated plasma that expands outward in a wave and scorches the surface of every planet within range. Atmosphere stripped, oceans vaporized, continents reduced to glass. Everything that lives, everything that grows, everything that breathes or moves or thinks, burned away in a tide of stellar fire that no shield and no bunker and no technology can withstand. I asked him what would happen if those platforms were aimed at a star with inhabited worlds orbiting it. He did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was on every face on the command deck, in every pair of eyes that stared at the field of stellar accelerators floating between us and Earth, in every breath that caught and held and refused to release. I heard the voice from the first transmission playing in my memory, calm, unhurried, speaking in our own language, with a precision that now felt like a blade being drawn. You want war? Then watch as your worlds burn. They had not been making threats. They had been describing a capability, and I was looking at the proof. I ordered the fleet into attack formation. 4,200 warships arranged themselves into the standard Dralhari assault configuration, a layered wall of overlapping fields of fire designed to concentrate maximum destructive power on a single defensive point. It was the formation that had shattered the Vorthan home fleet 3 centuries ago, the formation that had broken open the Alessi defense rings, the formation that had delivered victory in every engagement the Dominion had ever fought, across 600 years of unbroken military supremacy. Before we could fire a single shot, a ship emerged from behind one of the stellar accelerator platforms. Small, barely larger than a shuttle, unarmed, broadcasting an identification signal on every frequency simultaneously, its transponder screaming its presence across every band of the electromagnetic spectrum as if it wanted to make absolutely certain we could see it. My weapons officer targeted it reflexively, her hands moving before conscious thought could intervene. I ordered her to hold fire. An unarmed vessel approaching openly in the middle of a combat zone was either a surrender or a conversation, and I needed to know which. The ship carried one occupant. He identified himself as Director Cassius Marin of the United Human Defense Compact, and he requested a direct communication channel to me personally. My protocol officer stepped forward immediately, his face rigid with regulation. Direct communication with an enemy combatant outside of formal surrender proceedings was a violation of Dominion military engagement protocol. I overruled him without looking away from my screen. Something in my chest, some instinct sharpened by decades of command and the accumulated weight of every wrong assumption I had made in the past 30 days, told me that the next few minutes would determine whether anyone aboard these 4,000 ships would survive to see another rotation. Cassius Marin appeared on my display. He was older than his voice on the first transmission had suggested, weathered face lined with years of decisions that cost lives. Gray hair cropped short in what I recognized as a military cut. Eyes that held a steady, weary focus. The gaze of a man who has been carrying an enormous weight for a long time and is about to set it down, one way or another. He did not threaten. He did not posture. He did not deliver speeches or recite demands or quote treaties. He simply told me the truth, in that same careful Dralhari he had used in his first transmission, and the truth was worse than anything I had imagined. Earth was empty, not partially evacuated, not reduced to essential personnel, not defended by a hidden garrison waiting in underground bunkers. Empty, completely, entirely, deliberately empty. 8 billion human beings had been relocated from the planet's surface to dispersed habitats across more than 400 star systems in under 2 standard weeks. The cities were dark, the highways were still, the oceans lapped against deserted shorelines, the forests grew in silence. Earth, the cradle of their species, the world they had evolved on and built their civilization around, and loved with a fierce, proprietary tenderness that was evident in every piece of art and music and literature they had ever created, was a hollow shell. I heard my officers react behind me. Gasps. Whispered calculations. Someone pulled up the sensor data on the planet and confirmed it in a voice that shook. No thermal signatures consistent with a populated world. No electromagnetic emissions from active infrastructure. No orbital traffic. No atmospheric pollutants. Nothing but a beautiful, empty planet turning slowly in the light of its star. The logistics alone should have been impossible. Moving 8 billion individuals, with their supplies, their essential equipment, their medical needs, their children, across hundreds of light years to hundreds of separate destinations, in 14 days. My own transport command required weeks of advance planning to relocate a garrison of 50,000. The humans had moved a population 160,000 times that size in half a month, and they had done it so quietly that our intelligence network, crippled as it was, had not detected a single evacuation vessel. Marin watched my face as the reality settled. Then he continued. You came to destroy our homeworld, Admiral. We knew you would. We knew it the moment your council voted for war, because your doctrine is predictable, and your strategic thinking has not changed in 600 years. So we let you come. We left Earth empty, and we left the approach corridor clear, because we wanted you here. All of you. Every warship your Dominion could assemble, concentrated in one place, far from home, far from your supply lines, far from your sensor networks. He paused. You brought your entire fleet to attack an empty planet. Think about what that means. Before I could formulate a response, the ignition platforms activated. Not aimed at my fleet, aimed at a point in space approximately 40,000 kilometers from our formation, a point I had not noticed on the sensor display, because there was nothing there to notice. Nothing except a small, unassuming relay station barely the size of a standard cargo container, hanging in the void without running lights or active emissions. The focused beams converged on it, and it evaporated in a flash of white light. My navigation officer screamed a warning that came too late. The relay was part of the Dominion's faster-than-light navigation network, a positional anchor that our drive systems use to calculate transit vectors for the jump home. Without it, our drives couldn't lock onto the return coordinates. We could still travel at faster-than-light speed, but we couldn't plot a course to Draelhar Prime. Not directly. We would need to recalculate through a chain of secondary relays, a process that would take days of painstaking navigational work. You can't leave, Marin said quietly. Not quickly enough to matter. Then the humans emerged. They didn't come from one direction. They didn't pour through a breach in our formation or charge from a staging area beyond sensor range. They came from everywhere at once, materializing out of the fabric of the solar system itself, as if the planets and moons and asteroid fields had been holding them in their arms, waiting for this moment. Out of hollowed asteroids that had drifted among millions of identical rocks, indistinguishable from natural formations, until hatches blew open and ships streamed from their cores. Off the surfaces of moons where they had been sitting, powered down and invisible under that terrifying stealth coating, for days or weeks or months. From inside the rings of the sixth planet, where their hulls had hidden among billions of ice fragments, from beneath the rust-colored surface of the fourth planet, launching through concealed exits in the terrain that sealed behind them as if they had never existed. From behind every rock, every shadow, every piece of debris in the entire star system, thousands of ships. Not the capital warships our doctrine was designed to counter. Gunships, drone carriers, missile platforms, fast attack craft no bigger than our shuttles, each one bristling with weapons systems our sensors could barely classify. They surrounded the fleet in 3 dimensions, a closing sphere of firepower that contracted around 4,000 Draelhari warships like a fist closing around a throat. My weapons officer fired. Every ship in the fleet fired. The void lit up with the combined output of the greatest concentration of Draelhari military power ever assembled. 4,000 warships unleashing everything they had into the swarm of human vessels that surrounded them. Energy beams, kinetic projectiles, guided torpedoes, saturation fire designed to fill space so completely that nothing could survive within it. They hit almost nothing. The human ships were too fast, too small, too agile. They didn't dodge our fire the way conventional ships dodged, with predictable evasive patterns that a targeting computer could model and anticipate. They moved like living things, reacting to each shot individually, slipping through gaps in our firing solutions, with a fluidity that seemed to violate the mechanical limitations of spacecraft. Our weapons, designed to destroy ships that fought the way we fought, couldn't track targets that fought the way they fought. And then the humans began their response. Not a barrage, not a broadside, not the overwhelming concentrated fire that our doctrine called for in an engagement of this scale. Something precise, something surgical, something that demonstrated a level of weapons accuracy and tactical coordination that our military academies would have declared theoretically impossible. They targeted our engines. Ship by ship, the human strike craft closed to engagement range and delivered precisely calibrated beam strikes to specific points on our drive assemblies, not random hits. Targeted impacts at structural junctures that disabled the drive without damaging the surrounding hull or breaching the reactor containment. Each shot placed with an accuracy that should not have been achievable at combat velocities, aimed at weak points that our own engineers would have needed detailed schematics to identify. Destroyer after destroyer went dark, their engines burning out in controlled failures that left the ships intact but immobile. Cruisers drifted, their main drives trailing sparks and cooling metal. Battle cruisers, the armored flagships of the Dominion Navy, sat motionless in the void, while human gunships swarmed around them with the patient efficiency of surgeons operating on a body that could not resist. After the engines, they took the weapons. The same surgical approach, targeted strikes on weapons control relays, power distribution nodes, firing mechanism actuators, each shot placed with the same impossible accuracy, disabling each system without destroying the ship that housed it. They were not trying to kill my fleet. They were not trying to inflict casualties. They were disarming us, methodically and completely, the way you would take a blade from the hand of someone who had proven they couldn't be trusted with it. The engagement lasted 11 hours. 11 hours of systematic, controlled dismantlement carried out against the most powerful military force the Draelhari Dominion had ever assembled. My officers fought with everything training and desperation could provide. They adapted formations. They improvised countermeasures. They tried every tactic in the Draelhari combat archive and invented new ones on the spot when the old ones failed. Nothing worked. The humans had an answer for everything we attempted, a counter for every maneuver, a response to every adaptation, as if they had studied our doctrine the way a scholar studies a text, learning every principle and every pattern and every habitual response so thoroughly that they could predict our actions before we decided to take them. By the 8th hour, I stopped giving orders. There was nothing left to order. The Ashenvale's engines were dead. Our weapons were offline. Our sensor arrays had been reduced to passive receivers. Around us, the remnants of the Dominion fleet drifted in a field of crippled, powerless hulks, surrounded by human ships that orbited in patient, silent formations, like shepherds watching a flock that had finally stopped running. Draelhari casualties across the entire 11-hour engagement were less than 200. Out of a fleet crewing over 2 million personnel, fewer than 200 were dead. The humans had specifically, deliberately, systematically kept my crews alive while destroying our ability to fight or flee. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like being submerged in ice water, that this had never been a battle. It had never been intended as one. From the first vanished convoy to the empty planet, to the trap we had walked into with our eyes open and our confidence intact, every element of this war had been a demonstration, a lesson delivered by a teacher with infinite patience and overwhelming capability to a student who refused to learn any other way. Marin contacted me one final time. His face on the screen was the same as it had been at the beginning of our conversation. Tired, calm, carrying the weight of what he was about to say with the steadiness of a man who had lived with this knowledge for weeks and had made peace with every possible outcome. He told me what the ignition platforms were actually designed to target. Not Earth, not Sol. The platforms were aimed at 17 Draelhari colony worlds, core worlds, population centers, industrial hubs, worlds with billions of Draelhari civilians living their lives under the assumption that the Dominion's military would protect them from anything the galaxy could produce. The platforms could trigger a stellar cascade in any star within their operational range. The process would take approximately 6 standard hours, during which the target star would swell and burn with increasing intensity. its radiation output climbing exponentially until the habitable zone of its planetary system became an ocean of fire. Every world orbiting that star would be scorched clean. Atmosphere burned away, water vaporized, the surface heated to temperatures that would melt stone. 17 worlds, 60 billion Draelhari lives. We could have done this on the first day, Marin said. His voice was quiet, and for the first time, I heard something in it besides calm. Grief. He was grieving for what he might be forced to do. The platforms were operational before your fleet left Dominion space. We chose not to fire them. We chose to give you every opportunity to reconsider. You did not. He leaned forward, and the weariness in his eyes deepened into something rawer and more honest than anything I had seen from any adversary in 40 years of war. Here is what happens now, Admiral. You are going to transmit my terms to your council. Your council is going to accept them. And this war ends today, before another person on either side dies. Because if it does not end today, I will activate those platforms, and 60 billion of your people will watch their skies turn white, while their stars consume them. And I will carry that weight for the rest of my life, and every human alive will carry it with me, and we will never forgive you for making it necessary. He transmitted the terms. I read them on the silent command deck of my crippled flagship, surrounded by officers who had built their entire identities on the certainty that the Draelhari Dominion was the supreme military power in the galaxy, and that nothing could challenge that truth. I read each term carefully, from the first line to the last, and I understood that the universe we had known, the order we had imposed, the 6 centuries of conquest we had built our civilization around, was finished. I transmitted the terms to Draelhar Prime on an open channel. I did not encrypt the message. I did not route it through military command frequencies, where Tyramus could intercept and bury it before it reached the broader population. I broadcast it on the widest civilian frequency available, powerful enough to reach every communication receiver, from Sol to the homeworld, and every system in between. I did this deliberately. I did this because I knew Tyramus would try to suppress it, and I wanted to make suppression impossible. The terms were brutal in their simplicity. Full and immediate withdrawal of all Dominion military forces and civilian administrative presence from the Cathara corridor, including the dismantlement of every installation the Dominion had constructed there during the opening days of the war. Financial reparations paid to the families of every human killed in the initial strikes on Verada 4, Calliston Ring, and Themis Station, with the amount and distribution determined by human authorities. Permanent demilitarization of all Dominion forces within a buffer zone, extending 3 systems deep from human-claimed space in every direction, with compliance monitored and verified by independent observers from neutral species. And the final term, the one I knew would break Tyremus before he finished reading it, a public admission, broadcast to every species on the Galactic Communication Network, that the Draelhari Dominion had initiated an unprovoked war of aggression against humanity, had been defeated in that war, and was accepting terms dictated by the victors. Every species would hear it, every civilization that lived under Draelhari rule, or in Draelhari shadow. The Vorthan, who we had conquered and occupied for 2 centuries, and who still remembered what independence felt like. The Alessi, who had reorganized their entire society around Dominion governance, because they believed we were too powerful to resist. The Kelmarai, whose rebellion we had crushed within living memory, and whose survivors still nursed their grievances in silence. Every subjugated world, every tributary state, every species that obeyed us because they believed the Dominion was unstoppable, would hear, in our own words, on our own broadcast frequency, that we had been stopped, outmaneuvered, outfought, brought to our knees by a species we had publicly dismissed as fragmented, undisciplined, and weak. Tyremus responded within the hour. His message was short, stripped of diplomatic language, delivered in the clipped formal register he used when fury overwhelmed his capacity for political eloquence. He rejected the terms in their entirety. He rejected my authority to negotiate on behalf of the Dominion. He rejected the premise that the war was lost, and he ordered me, in language that left no room for interpretation, to fight to the last ship, the last crew member, the last functional weapon system, rather than accept the disgrace of capitulation. I stood on the command deck of the Ashenvale, Engines dead, weapons dark, sensors blind, and I looked at the faces around me. My weapons officer, who had served at my side for 15 years, whose daughter had just entered the Naval Academy on Draelhar Prime, with dreams of commanding a destroyer. My navigation officer, a young man from a colony world on the Dominion's outer rim, who had joined the fleet because he believed in what the Dominion represented and wanted to be part of something larger than himself. My intelligence chief, who had been catastrophically wrong about the humans, and knew it, and had spent the past 11 hours staring at his darkened console with the hollow expression of a man watching every certainty he ever held dissolve into nothing. These were my people, my crew, my responsibility. They had followed me into 8 campaigns across 40 years. They had trusted me to lead them well and to bring them home. And Tyramus, sitting in his comfortable chamber on Draelhar Prime, surrounded by guards and advisors and the insulating luxury of power, was ordering me to spend their lives to preserve his pride. I opened a private channel to every ship captain in the fleet, 4,200 individual connections, carrying my voice to 4,200 officers who were sitting in crippled vessels in the dark, waiting for someone to tell them what happened next. I did not make a speech. I did not invoke duty or honor or the glorious legacy of the Dominion, or any of the grand abstractions that leaders use to make the deaths of their subordinates sound noble. I asked one question: do you want your crews to die for Tyremus? The vote took less than 3 minutes. It was unanimous. Not a single captain dissented. Not one voice among 4,000 argued for continued resistance. The officers of the Draelhari fleet, the most experienced and decorated military professionals in the galaxy, looked at their situation with clear eyes and reached the same conclusion I had reached. The war was over. It had been over before it started. And dying for the vanity of a man who had led them to this catastrophe was not an acceptable way to end it. I accepted humanity's terms on behalf of the Third Expansion Fleet and the assembled armada of the Draelhari Dominion. I transmitted the acceptance on the same open civilian channel I had used before, wide enough to reach every receiver in every system between Sol and Draelhar Prime. I attached my personal seal, my rank authentication, and the digital signatures of all 4,200 ship captains. Tyramus would receive it at the same moment as every other being in the galaxy with a working receiver, and by the time he composed his countermand, it would already be too late. The words were spoken. The galaxy had heard. History had recorded them. The war was over. The humans restored our engines within 2 standard days, not our weapons, not our sensor arrays, not our communications beyond basic short range, just our engines, enough to move but not enough to fight, enough to limp home but not enough to pose a threat. They escorted us to the edge of the Sol system, in the same patient, silent formations they had maintained during the engagement, their ships holding position around our crippled fleet, like wardens guiding prisoners who had earned supervised release. We engaged our drives and began the long journey back to Draelhar Prime. The journey took 14 rotations. It was the longest voyage of my career, not because of the distance or the speed, or the navigational complications of traveling without weapons or full sensor capability, because of the silence. 4,000 warships moving in formation through the dark between stars, and nobody spoke. My officers sat at their stations and stared at displays that showed nothing but empty space ahead and the memory of total defeat behind. Some of them wept, quietly, privately, turned away from their comrades, letting the tears fall in the dimmed light of consoles that had nothing left to display. Some of them simply sat motionless, processing a reality that their training and their culture and their entire understanding of the galaxy had not prepared them to accept. The Draelhari Dominion, conqueror of 11 species, 6 centuries undefeated, the most powerful military civilization in the known galaxy, had been brought to complete and unconditional surrender in under 40 standard rotations by a species we had classified as a minor regional presence. When we arrived at Draelhar Prime, Tyramus was already gone. The council had deposed him 3 days after my open transmission reached the homeworld, not because he had started the war, but because he had lost it. The distinction matters, and it tells you everything you need to understand about the institution I served for 4 decades. They did not remove him for the arrogance of attacking a species that had done us no harm. They did not remove him for the criminal negligence of relying on intelligence assessments that were wrong at every level. They removed him for the embarrassment of public failure. If we had won, if the humans had broken the way the Vorthen broke, and the Alessi broke, and the Kelmarai broke, Tyramus would have been celebrated as the greatest conqueror in Dominion history. His removal was not justice, it was reputation management. The new council, staffed by the same governors who had voted 15-2 for Operation Ashfall, immediately attempted to bury the war. They classified every document, every communication log, every sensor recording, every intelligence assessment, every piece of evidence that the Dryalhari Dominion had started a war of aggression, prosecuted it with incompetence at every level of command, and been forced to surrender by an enemy that could have destroyed them and chose mercy instead. They reassigned every officer who had participated. They scrubbed the military archives. They rewrote the official history to describe the conflict as a bilateral border negotiation that had been resolved through mutual diplomatic engagement, resulting in territorial clarification. They wanted the Dryalhari people to forget it had ever happened. They wanted the galaxy to forget. They wanted the conquered species living under Dominion rule to believe that the power holding them down was still invincible, and that the broadcast from Sol had been a fabrication, propaganda, a misunderstanding. I refused. I refused the reassignment they offered me to a quiet administrative posting, where I would spend my remaining years filing supply requisitions and keeping my mouth shut. I refused the gag order. I refused the official history. I refused to participate in the institutional lie that the worst strategic catastrophe in Dominion history had been a diplomatic conversation. And I began writing this debrief. I write it knowing it has ended my career. I write it from the frozen exile post where the council sent me when I refused to stop writing, a tiny outpost on a frozen moon at the edge of charted space, where the temperature outside the habitat module drops to levels that would kill an unprotected Dryalhari in minutes, and where my only company is a communications terminal that I suspect the council monitors, but no longer considers worth the effort to shut down. I write it anyway. I write it because the truth matters more than my comfort, and because someone must explain, clearly, and without political obfuscation, what we did wrong, and what it cost us, so that no one in the Dominion ever makes this mistake again. Our error was not underestimating human technology, although we underestimated it so badly that our engineering division should be dissolved and rebuilt from the ground level upward. It was not underestimating their fleet capacity, although their fleet turned out to be orders of magnitude larger, faster, and more sophisticated than anything our intelligence had projected. It was not underestimating their industrial base, although a species that can evacuate 8 billion people in 2 weeks clearly possesses manufacturing and logistics capabilities that dwarf anything the Dominion has achieved in 6 centuries. Our mistake was misunderstanding what humans are. Every species the Dominion has conquered shares a common structural trait. They are hierarchical. They have leaders, command chains, institutional frameworks that concentrate decision-making authority in a small number of key individuals. Destroy those leaders, and the population loses direction. Break the chain of command, and the army dissolves into individuals. Shatter the center, and the periphery scatters. Our entire doctrine, our entire military philosophy, our entire approach to conquest is built on this principle. And it works because it exploits a structural vulnerability that is woven into the social fabric of most civilized species. Humans have no single center. Their fragmentation, the competing governments and independent colonies, and cultural diversity, and political disagreement that our analysts photographed and measured and categorized as weakness, is not a flaw in their civilization. It is its greatest strength. It is redundancy engineered into the species at the deepest possible level, not by design, but by evolution, by millions of years of survival on a planet that tried to kill them every single day in every possible way. There is no single leader whose removal ends the fight. Kill one, and 3 more step forward before the body is cold, each one carrying the same determination, the same capability, the same absolute refusal to accept defeat. There is no capital whose destruction breaks the collective will. Destroy one city, and the population scatters to 100 other cities and begins rebuilding before the dust settles. There is no chain of command to sever, because every individual human is capable of functioning as their own command structure, assessing their situation, making decisions, taking action, and coordinating with their neighbors without waiting for orders that may never come. You cannot conquer a species that has no center to attack. You cannot demoralize a civilization that distributes its will across billions of autonomous individuals. You cannot impose surrender on a people who do not require centralized authority to tell them when to fight and when to stop. They evolved on a world that tried to kill them with predators. They killed the predators. Their world tried to kill them with ice ages. They survived the ice. Their world tried to kill them with disease, with famine, with earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and floods and droughts and 100 other mechanisms of natural destruction that would have ended most species before they left their caves. They survived all of it. They turned their death world into a garden, and then they looked up at the stars and began the same process on a galactic scale. And they did it not in spite of their fragmentation, but because of it. Every competing government was a backup plan. Every independent colony was a lifeboat. Every cultural variation was an experiment in survival. They built redundancy into everything because their planet taught them, across a geological timescale of relentless natural selection, that anything with a single point of failure eventually fails. I have one final detail to include in this record, and I have kept it from the Council because they lack the capacity to understand it, and because it frightens me more than anything else in this entire account. During the 11 hours of the engagement at Seoul, while my fleet was being systematically and methodically dismantled by human strike forces, my communications officers intercepted transmissions from the civilian habitats scattered throughout the solar system, the habitats where the 8 billion evacuated humans were living. These were not military communications. They were not encrypted command signals or tactical coordination channels. They were civilian broadcasts, picked up on standard frequencies, carrying the ordinary sounds of ordinary life. Music, laughter, children playing games, and calling to each other across habitat corridors. Conversations about meals and weather simulations and weekend plans. An old man reading a bedtime story to a child who kept interrupting with questions. Two women discussing a recipe they were going to try the next day. A group of teenagers arguing about which team was going to win some sporting event I had never heard of. 8 billion people, evacuated from their homeworld, displaced to temporary shelters scattered across an entire star system, living in artificial habitats while the largest alien war fleet in galactic history was being dismantled in the sky above them, and they were going about their daily lives as if it were any other ordinary day. They were not afraid. They were not huddled in shelters praying for survival. They were not glued to news feeds watching the battle unfold. They were cooking dinner. They were tucking children into bed. They were laughing at jokes. Because they knew, they had known from the beginning. From the moment Adela Vasic read our ultimatum and closed the channel with that single quiet nod, from the moment Cassius Marin recorded his 9-word transmission in our own language, every human being across every world and every habitat in their civilization had known exactly how this war would end. Not hoped, not believed. Known, with the bedrock certainty of a species that had planned for this outcome and built the tools to guarantee it, and distributed the knowledge so widely that no individual's capture or death could compromise the plan. Every step of the war had been choreographed. The communications blackout that we interpreted as collapse was a coordinated operational security measure. The vanishing convoys, the stripped defense grids, the gutted listening posts were not desperate strikes by a cornered enemy, but phases in a strategic plan that had been designed, tested, and refined long before we sent our first ultimatum. The empty approach corridor that led us to Seoul was not a gap in their defenses. It was a funnel, guiding us precisely where they wanted us to go. And the empty planet at the end of it was the closing mechanism of a trap so elegant and so comprehensive that we walked into it with pride and confidence and never suspected a thing until the doors shut behind us. We thought we were the predators. We were the prey. From the very first day, from the very first moment, Tyramus set his eyes on the Cathara corridor. We were the prey. And we didn't know it until the jaws closed. This document is not a military analysis. It is not a strategic assessment, or an after-action report, or a historical account. It is a warning. I write it for every Draelhari commander who will come after me, every council member who will sit in that semicircular chamber and weigh the costs and benefits of expansion, every ambitious adjudicator who will look at the stars and see resources to be taken and species to be bent to the Dominion's will. I write it so they will know what happened when we chose to challenge the humans. Not the sanitized version, not the classified summary, not the diplomatic fiction the Council constructed to protect its reputation. The truth. Every miscalculation, every humiliation, every moment of dawning horror as we realized, too late and too slowly, that the fractured, disorganized, undisciplined species we had dismissed as prey was the most dangerous civilization this galaxy has ever produced. The man on the transmission told us to watch as our worlds burned. And here is the detail that follows me through every sleepless night in this frozen exile. The detail I stare at through my window while ice crystals form on the glass and the wind howls against the habitat walls. The humans never burned a single Draelhari world. Not one. They had the capability. They had the technology deployed and operational. They had the moral justification. We struck first. We killed their people. We destroyed their colonies. We bombarded civilian settlements from orbit. By every law of war, every principle of proportional response, every standard of justified retaliation recognized by any civilization in the galaxy, they had earned the right to aim those stellar accelerators at our worlds and turn 17 suns into instruments of annihilation. They chose not to. They showed mercy, not weakness, not hesitation, not the mercy of a victor too exhausted to continue. The deliberate, conscious mercy of a civilization strong enough to hold the power of stellar fire in its hands and choose, freely and without compulsion, not to use it. They could have ended us. They could have burned our worlds and scattered our ashes across the void and ensured that no Draelhari voice would ever again speak the word conquest. They had every reason and every capability and every justification. And they put down the weapon. They let us go. They sent us home in our crippled ships with our wounded pride, and they went back to their habitats and their music, and their children's laughter, and their recipes, and their bedtime stories, as if the matter was settled and required no further discussion. That mercy is the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed, because mercy is a choice, and choices can be reversed. What was given freely can be withdrawn. The restraint they showed was not a permanent condition of their nature. It was a decision made by a species that calculates its responses with a sophistication we cannot match, and executes those responses with a capability we cannot counter. If the Dominion ever forces them to choose differently, if we ever push past the threshold where their restraint ends and their fury begins, there will be no crippled fleet limping home through silent space. There will be no terms transmitted on open channels. There will be no chance to vote, to negotiate, to surrender, to beg. There will be 17 suns burning brighter than nature intended, and 60 billion Draelhari lives extinguished in a wave of fire so complete that the galaxy will not remember we existed. Do not test them again. Do not provoke them. Do not mistake their laughter for inattention, or their kindness for weakness, or their patience for inability. Do not look at their fractured politics and their noisy disagreements, and their chaotic, sprawling, maddeningly unpredictable civilization, and see what you want to see instead of what is actually there. They are not what we thought they were. They are not what anyone in this galaxy thinks they are. They are a species forged by a world that spent 4 billion years trying to kill them, and they answered that world with stubbornness and ingenuity and an absolute refusal to die, and they carried that answer with them to the stars. And if you are wise, truly wise, you will never find out what they become when mercy is no longer an option they are willing to choose. Filed under Never Again. Admiral Velith Soranus, last commander of the 3rd Expansion Fleet, writing from exile.